Hello and welcome to everybody. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and today I'll be introducing Chapter 3 of my book, Iesus, Deus. For those of you interested in the introduction, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, there are videos on that as well. And I encourage everybody to go watch those and catch up. These videos are specifically meant for people who are interested in the book and are interested in a teaser introduction, and in hopes that you will purchase the book. For those of you who have already purchased the book, you can use these videos to kind of as a great lighthouse to guide you through the main points so that you don't get lost in the jungle of details, and hopefully reinforce your understanding of the chapters. So without further ado, thanks to everybody for joining, and I'm going to lift off. So chapter 3 of Iesus Deus is called Deus est Juvara, Miracles, Morals, and Euergetism in Origins contra Celsum. This is a bit of a, let's say, a feast of words. Deus est Juvara means God is that which assists or helps. God is the fact of helping. And this was a saying of Pliny the Elder when he was defining God. And this book is all about how ancients thought about God and what they thought that a God was. And so Deus est Juvara is about that side of divinity which is related to benefaction, that is giving goods or supplying good things such as healing, such as teaching, such as moral improvement, as we'll see, and for very basic things also, like hurting your enemy. So another way of saying benefaction is euergetism, and this comes from the Greek eu meaning something good, and ergo to work. So doing good works. And Origins contra Celsum, or Against Celsus, is his great book written around 250 against Celsus, who is writing probably in the 170s of Alexandria. And I've got an episode on Celsus for those of you wanting to follow that up in the Patreon. I'll just remind everybody of the thesis of the book, namely that early Christians deified Jesus in their literature for the same reason that other ancient Mediterranean peoples deified their heroes, rulers, and benefactors. Jesus was, in this sense, hardly unique, and it's important to recognize that and to recognize the logic of what I consider to be the discursive or literary deification of Jesus, that is, the full-on description of Jesus as a divine being. And in chapter 1, we begin with Jesus's very first experience of human life, which is his conception and birth. As for the chapter thesis, I argue that Celsus and Origen employed strikingly similar notions of divinity, despite their disagreements on how that divinity ought to be portrayed or displayed. So Celsus being the Hellenic critic of Christianity and Origen being the Christian apologists are actually agreeing on the deep structure level of what a God is, and are making arguments and talking to each other based on those deep structure agreements. So hopefully, as you're going through this chapter, which is quite long and full of twists and turns, you can keep this basic thesis in mind and use it as your guiding light for going through everything. So one of the most important cultural antecedents for everybody to understand is a philosophical and a literary development called Euhemerism. And Euhemerus was, sometimes he's called an atheist. Euhemerus was essentially a literary person who wrote something like a novel, almost, I guess we could call it something like a fantasy novel, but he wrote it as if it were historical fiction. And in this novel, he portrayed the deities of old as people, and specifically people who had done tremendously wonderful works for humanity. So benefactors, human benefactors, who, in recognition of their divine works or their wonderful benefactions after their deaths, were deified. And this is how Euhemerus presented the origin of all gods worshipped in the Mediterranean. So Zeus, for instance, was really an ancient king who went around the world doing good. And so was Heracles, so was Apollo, so was Hermes. And Zeus's entire family was this rich and royal family who, because of their amazingly good deeds and assistance to humans, were all deified after their death. And this family then became known as the Olympians. So it's not exactly atheism, of course. It's not saying that the gods don't exist, but it's saying that the gods presently worshipped were people in very ancient times. But the main point that I want to underscore for Euhemerus is he's agreeing and promoting an idea in his culture that it's divine benefaction which gets people to recognize your godhood. And so it's not only in the past that this principle worked, it's also in the present. So Dionysus in the past gave humans the vine, viticulture, wine drinking, etc. This was an amazing benefit. Demeter or Demeter gave humans agriculture and cereals and bread and showed them how to earn a livelihood from the ground. This was an amazing benefit. And for both figures, they were deified after their death for their amazing benefit. Well, in a sense, it's no different than it was for Augustus, who was considered a god both in his lifetime and after his lifetime for the amazing benefits that he produced. And in his case, the benefits were things like peace, okay, stability, political stability. If your city had an earthquake, the Roman emperor had the funds to rebuild your city. And there'd be inscriptions and statues set up for Augustus. Augustus, at the end of his life, had essentially a list called the Res Gestae of all the benefits that he produced for the Mediterranean world, the Roman people and beyond. And he was obviously proud of that. And it's one of the reasons that Augustus was so quickly deified after his death officially by the Roman Senate, although for most Hellenes and Hellenized peoples, he was already considered a god in his lifetime. And the principle that they're working with, again, is benefaction. That's it. It's not because he's immortal. I mean, obviously his body dies. It's not because he is literally superhuman like Superman. I mean, he can't fly, etc., or, have lasers shoot out of his eyes. It is because of his benefactions, and that alone was enough to promote him to deity in the eyes of some, at least, Mediterranean peoples. I know that many in the 20th century were skeptical that humans could believe that this dictator was a god, but I am firmly convinced that at least some people did actually believe that in the ancient Mediterranean, and they believed that because this god on earth did good things. So it's on this structural level that early Christians began comparing Jesus with other Greco-Roman gods. I mean, you can look at specific examples like Dionysus giving wine and Jesus giving his blood as wine, but that's still a bit superficial. What we're talking about is this general concept of providing an amazing benefit. And so when thinking about the deification, the early Christian deification of Jesus, they were thinking like Mediterranean peoples. They got something from Jesus very concretely in terms of their experience. They benefited from him. Okay. Now you still see this today where people talk about, the tremendous benefits of salvation, but it's not just salvation from hell. It's, healing of your body today. Some people think that, Jesus helps them in their finances or gives them financial rewards, nice new cars, big house. Um, and this is very much how ancient people dealt with their gods too. You ask gods for benefits, and when you receive those benefits, you credit the god with those benefits, and your faith in the god is reinforced by the reception of those benefits, which you take to be coming from the god. So with this background in mind, it makes perfect sense for why Celsus in the 170s would be tapping the shoulder of Christians and asking very concretely, very forcefully and poignantly, what divine benefit does Jesus actually give? Because when Celsus read the Gospels, it didn't look like Jesus was giving benefits at all. I mean, Celsus considered, the accounts of the crucifixion in particular as a terrible embarrassment. Jesus producing a death cry on the cross and dying in agony and weakness. Celsus didn't see this as the production of benefits. But Origen, when he is responding to Celsus, does, I think, logically point out that, yes, Christians view Jesus as a divine benefactor, just like other Mediterranean peoples viewed their gods, Apollo, Dionysus, Demeter, as divine benefactors. And Jesus's benefactions were his miracles, healing the lame and blind, walking on water, and so forth, protecting people from storms, feeding them, etc., etc. But for Origen, all of these were, even for him, miracles in the past. And what was needed was something concrete, something that Christians of his time also experienced. And so Origen really drove home the point that the main miracle of Jesus was an ongoing one, that Jesus made people good. He generated in criminals, basically, or, low lifes who converted to Christianity, virtue. And today you still see this argument sometimes, where people will credit Jesus or some other deity with helping them through a drug addiction, or maybe saving them from financial disaster, and causing them to think about more, so shall we say, serious things, and becoming more family oriented and becoming a better father or a better mother or a better sister or a better brother. These are the kinds of things that Origen was pointing up. Now, of course, today we might want to argue against Origen that being Christian certainly doesn't involve necessarily any moral improvement, and one can point to some cases, some of them very extreme cases, such as the molestation of children by Roman Catholic priests, and surely there are exceptions. But Origen's point, to be fair, was that on a general level, generally, Christians were better people than their neighbors because they were more generous, they were more charitable, they were more interested in helping out, they were more hospitable. And it's these virtues that he was emphasizing as the benefit that Jesus gave to the world. Now, what's really important to grasp here is that Origen isn't inventing things. He's not being utterly innovative here in terms of his understanding of what are the primary divine benefits. This is, and what he has said is really an adaptation of something the Stoics had said hundreds of years before Origen, and that is that the primal benefit of of deities is not that they're super strong or that they, can walk through walls or whatever, or, walk on water, as the case may be. It is that they produce virtue. They demonstrate and exemplify virtue, and they produce virtue in other people. They become paradigms of virtue. And this is called apotheosis, deity routine, or deification through virtue on account of virtue. Virtue, essentially, comes from the Latin word virtus, which means manliness, but it had expanded its meaning and been moralized by the Stoics so that it was primarily focused on the moral sphere. And this is the innovation that Origen adapts in his counterpunch to Celsus. So just to give you an example, we have an ancient writer influenced by the Stoics called Herodotus. And Herodotus allegorized the life of Heracles, or at least episodes in the life of Heracles. You'll recall that Heracles is the great strong man, the great superman, as it were, of ancient Greece, and he underwent 12 labors. And one of these labors was the taking the golden apples of the Hesperides. And this occurred in Africa, and there was a tree with golden apples, and it was guarded by a snake. This should definitely remind you of the Garden of Eden. And Heracles, according to the story, overcame the snake and took the golden apples, and therefore succeeded. So what Herodotus and others did was that he allegorized this tale, and he knew and he used the tale to carve out a new moral meaning. So for him, he identified the snake as what he called variegated reasoning of bitter passion. And the club by which Heracles overcame the snake is philosophy, which involves self-discipline. His lion's skin, which he wore, refers not to a literal pelt, but to his noble disposition. And the 3 apples that he achieves are all virtues: resistance to growing angry, resistance to the love of money, and resistance to the love of pleasure. And with these virtues in place, Heracles became a good man. And so the moral of the story is just that it makes you more moral, that it's about achieving a certain level of morality with Heracles as the example. And the point is not that he, clubbed a snake to death. The point is that he mastered his own passions and violent emotions in order to achieve rule over himself. And that's the moral lesson. And these kinds of stoicizing interpretations of mythology had been in place for hundreds of years before Origen. So this is important to keep in mind for the intellectual context. So in sum, Origen is adopting and adapting this stoicizing emphasis on deification through specifically moral virtue. So this is the great benefit. This is the only significant benefit that truly deifies people. I mean, you can be very big and strong and shoot lasers out of your eyes, but if you're not good and if you're not an example of good, then you are worthless for Origen. Because what makes you a god are moral deeds, good deeds. And that is what is going to get you to graduate into heaven, be uplifted into heaven, so to speak. And he is in perfect agreement with his philosophical culture in this regard. There's a lot of things that Origen says, and for those, I can't recommend enough that you just pick up Origen Contra Celsum. It is translated by Henry Chadwick, and there's a paperback from Cambridge. So pick that up if you can. But I'll just give you this quote kind of sum things up as a sampler. Quote, the things done to Jesus are not in conflict with the accepted notion of God, Origen says. He endured um, as would the perfect man what must be endured by a man who does all in his power on behalf of the entire human family and of rational beings as well. There's nothing objectionable in the fact, here's the apologetic point, that a man died, and in that his death should be given as an example of the way to die for the sake of religion, unquote. So when Celsus points out that, the way that Jesus died is a terrible shame and embarrassment to Christianity, Origen sort of turns this on its head, and this is the creative bit where Jesus is modeling how to die nobly, and it's very much part of the noble death tradition. And there is a book on this by James Tabor called A Noble Death. There's a co-author there. The co-author is escaping me at the moment, but you can pick that up because that is also relevant for further reading. And again, just reading the Contra Celsum is a primary text is even more important, though. Here again, though, however, it's important to emphasize that even where Origen is innovative in his interpretation of what Christ's death meant, it was not utterly unique, right? Because Stoics and others who had sort of assimilated this philosophical culture had argued that men like Heracles were also an example of how to die nobly. I mean, Heracles, after all, knew that he was going to die, and he asked people to build a pyre and to burn him alive. And so he showed, without whimpering or quivering, how to die as a person of virtue, as someone who knew his time had come and was very patiently and willingly going to his Father. So this is something, again, that Origen is adapting for his particular hero. Origen will apologetically try to destroy the moral reputation of figures like Asclepius and Heracles and Dionysus, and he has a lot of data to do that. But it's sort of a too clever by half move, because we have to distinguish, the popular tradition of Greco-Roman mythology, where gods are doing all sorts of amoral things, and the philosophical interpretation of Greco-Roman mythology, where the gods are moral exemplars and examples of how to live morally. And so Origen is, adopting very creatively the philosophical culture and the philosophical culture's emphasis on deification through virtue and the use of, the mythology to prove that. And he's basically using his own mythology to say that Jesus fits that paradigm even better. And in order to undercut the views of his philosophical opponents, he borrows freely from the popular mythological tradition, which was not allegorized. So it's a somewhat sneaky move, and one should always keep that in mind, that Origen is double dipping, as it were, in trying to win an argument. But I think that the point is made, and the point is that Origen and Celsus are both agreeing that benefaction, and I think specifically moral benefaction, moral euergetism, as I call it, is what makes legitimate gods in Greco-Roman antiquity. And it was because Jesus fit that paradigm, or was made to fit it, that he also, among Christians, came to be viewed as a Greco-Roman deity. Thank you very much for seeing and viewing this presentation. If it helped you I sincerely hope that you'll offer a like and provide a comment. I can answer your questions on the Patreon, and I warmly welcome everyone to contribute. Till next time, take care.